Welcome to our continuing series of Virtual Voices. We are grateful for your letters and comments, and particularly for the questions that we have been receiving lately. Our program focus on the Sustainable Development Goals in order to be able to make a healthier, safer planet for our future generations. Our speaker today is the UN Affair and Strategy representative at Accenture's London office, the UN Global Compact partner. He is also on the executive board of World Information Transfer, representing WIT at many of the UN conferences in Poland, Paris, and Bonn, among others. Over to you, Apurv.
Thank you so much, Dr. Durbach, and it's a thrill and a pleasure to be back joining the Virtual Voices series World Information Transfer kicked off almost 1 year ago. Today, I'll be talking about all of the important diplomatic missions taking place around the globe from now until the end of the year, where we will sort of understand the significance of various organizations hosting some of these summits, the reason that they will be hosting them, and the key topics and focus areas that will be prevalent during these meetings. So without much ado, let me kick off with the first meeting that has global eyes of the international community peeled on, and that is the spring meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, taking place from 5th of April to 11th of April. Now, these are annual meetings that are held by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. It is when both of these organizations collaboratively understand and decide how the sustainable developmental goals need to be financed in both the developed and the developing world. The focus this year is going to be on green resilience, specifically helping countries build a green and resilient recovery from COVID-19. It's expected to be attended by about 2,800 delegates, about 350 observer organizations, 800 members of the press, and about 550 civil society participants, including organizations such as World Information Transfer. And this year, the World Bank and the IMF are really focusing on 3 core topics for financing. They're focusing on solutions for air quality in South Asia, accelerating the green transition, so that is transitioning from fossil fuel use to renewable energy in Europe, and achieving carbon neutrality in East Asia and the Pacific. Right, so this is taking place again from the 5th of April to the 11th of April, held by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The second in our series of key international events taking place is actually the virtual session of Davos that is taking place from the 25th to the 28th of May. Essentially, well, actually, for someone who doesn't have an understanding, the World Economic Forum is an organization that was formed in 1971, and it has come to be known for its annual meetings conducted at Davos, which is the highest region in all of Europe. But the ski town, the small little quaint ski town resort, isn't actually known for its steep slopes, but actually that annually the world congregates and business leaders, world leaders, parliamentarians gather together and discuss issues of global significance. Some very interesting ideas in the past, Dr. Durbach, have come out of Davos, such as the North American Free Trade Agreement that is signed between Canada, Mexico, and the US. That was something that was actually proposed at Davos back in the day. The World Economic Forum theme for this year is the Great Reset. And the entire idea is to rethink the global economy. We have reached a position in the global economy where we are facing insatiable amount of growth and consumption. Right? Let's take an industry like the automobile industry, for example. Currently, we have about 1.2 billion cars out on the road, right? With the projections that we currently have, we are expected to have 2 billion cars on the road by 2030, from 1.2 today to 2 billion cars on the road by 2030. The emissions currently being released by cars globally today is 3.4 billion gigatons. If these trends continue, by 2030, we will be faced with 5.7 billion gigatons of carbon emissions just from the automobile industry, right? According to the Paris Agreement, we need to reach a cap of 1.6 billion gigatons to be in line with a 1.5 degrees Celsius climate global limit. So we really have to fundamentally rethink how we are purchasing things in the world today, how we are consuming things, and essentially what it is we are consuming. Mobility trends aren't going to change. People are always going to buy cars. They will have a need to get from point A to point B. So how do we rethink this? How do we create a place in the world where we can sort of match global mobility needs with cars that produce 60% less CO2 emissions? So that requires a fundamental rethinking of our global economy and how certain industries function. And that is what the World Economic Forum is putting all its thinking behind this year. So again, from the 25th to the 28th of May, the virtual Davos sessions will be taking place, and they are going to be rethinking the global economy. Then around mid-June, we will have the International Energy Agency launching their Energy Summit. Now, here's a really interesting statistic. About every year, global emissions just from the textile industry, right? Just from the industry that produces all of our clothes, equates to about 1.2 billion gigatons of carbon dioxide. That is the combined emissions from all international flights and shipping that takes place. So we can understand how much energy, something as simple as a t-shirt uses in the world today. So the International Energy Agency in mid-June will be hosting their annual energy summit, which will be focused on clean energy transitions. How do we transition all industries globally to run on clean energy? The International Energy Agency will also be releasing the world's first roadmap to net zero by 2050, right? We know that the world, we need to limit our carbon emissions globally. The Paris Agreement created a mechanism to help the world understand how we can limit those emissions by up to 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the decade, with net zero emissions by 2050. But we still lack a clear and consistent roadmap on exactly how do we reach there. And so the International Energy Agency is actually taking the first stab at creating the world's most comprehensive roadmap of achieving net zero by 2050, outlining what people like us, everyday consumers, need to do, what businesses need to do, and what countries and governments need to do by 2050. In July, this is not a summit, but this is a very important report. In July, the IPCC is releasing its 6th assessment for a 1.5 degree climate limit. In 2015, governments together met at the Conference of the Parties in Paris to create the Paris Agreement. and they set out a roadmap of limiting global emissions to 2 degrees Celsius by 2030. 2 years later, the IPCC launched their assessment, and they said that actually a 2 degrees Celsius would be late. We need to achieve for 1.5 degrees by 2030 to avoid some of the most catastrophic events that could be faced by our planet. The IPCC released that if we don't align with a 1.5 degree target, we could start seeing an increased number of forest fires, which we already have been seeing in this past year, starting out from Australia, running to California. Severe chronic health diseases associated with air pollution, and the mass species extinction that we have ever witnessed before if we fail to align with the 1.5. So the IPCC reports are incredibly helpful in laying out what exactly is needed from the world and how businesses, governments, and consumers need to align. Coming to August, the World Economic Forum is now in May, they're meeting virtually. In August is going to be the first face-to-face World Economic Forum session. And that takes place from 17th to 20th of August in Singapore. And this will be the world's first face-to-face meeting of business leaders, of parliamentarians, of world leaders taking place in Singapore, assessing what the world needs to recover from COVID and to transition to a clean economy. We haven't had this meeting since the pandemic began. Everything went virtual, but the World Economic Forum meeting in Singapore will be the first of its meeting. In November, and this is perhaps the biggest international event taking place this year, sort of attracting almost 30,000 delegates from around the world, is going to be the UNFCCC COP26, which takes place from the 1st to the 12th of November. And the main idea behind COP26 is that this will be the first 5-year assessment from the Paris Agreement. So in 2015, the Conference of the Parties met up in Paris to produce what is now known as the Paris Agreement. For those of you who are not aware, the Paris Agreement is a legally binding document that holds all parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change accountable to reduce emissions by 2030 well below 2 degrees Celsius. And this will be the first 5-year review of where countries and businesses and governments have reached in that analysis. In between, Dr. Durbach, if we have questions coming in from the participants,
yes,
I'm happy to sort of
we
take
do,
them.
but could you be so kind and give the acronym for ICPT and the acronyms that you use so that people know exactly what we're talking about?
Yes, definitely. So the first acronym I mentioned was UNFCCC, and that stands for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is a body of the United Nations that is primarily responsible for hosting the International Forum on Climate Negotiations. It has a total of 196 parties, and their main mission is to reduce concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions. The IPCC, I mentioned, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And annually, they assess where the world is at in terms of carbon emissions, and they help identify the various knock-on effects of greenhouse gases contained in the world's atmosphere. and its implications on a variety of matters.
Okay, so one of the questions that I would like to ask you, could you explain a little bit more about why is it very important that the World Economic Forum meet, and to what extent will its resolution have an impact?
Yes, definitely. So the primary reason for the World Economic Forum this year meeting in Singapore in August is to discuss COVID recovery, right? COVID-19 has had a severely negative impact on the sustainability agenda, right? So the economic fallout, and I'll paint a picture over here across the SDGs. So number one, on SDG 1, no poverty. The economic fallout of the global pandemic has increased global poverty by as much as 500 million more people, or 8% of the total human population has now entered poverty due to COVID-19 and its direct impacts. That has reversed almost 30 years of progress, right? So that's one. Second, by the end of 2020, already 130 million people were on the brink of starvation due to the impacts of COVID-19. So COVID-19 has significantly disrupted various parts of our economy and society, right? In addition to being a health emergency. We have lost almost 400 million full-time jobs due to COVID, and these are jobs that may never come back. And the income of informal workers across the globe is expected to drop by almost 60% in comparison to last year. So these are some implications that COVID-19 has had, and the world till date has never met face to face in defining what a roadmap out of this entire catastrophe looks like, which is why it is extremely important for the World Economic Forum Singapore meeting to take place in August, to collectively gather the world and decision makers and figure out exactly how and what changes need to be made across the global economy and our infrastructures that can benefit all people globally.
All right, this is another question from one of our students. I would like to ask Mr. Gupta, what responsibilities does he have as a board member of WIT, and at the same time, his responsibilities with UN conferences and Accenture?
Excellent, my favorite question. So my responsibilities with World Information Transfer are quite varied. I support the organization in collectively disseminating some of this information through the Virtual Voices series. I oftentimes author or review articles that are published in our World Ecology Report. I provide guidance and support to our incoming cohorts of interns annually. And I also engage the board of directors of the World Information Transfer as a secretary on the board of directors. In terms of leading conferences, I've had the pleasure of leading 3 delegations, World Information Transfer delegations to the conferences of the parties, the UNFCCC COPs in the past, including the conference of the parties that took place in Paris just ahead of the Paris Agreement. And from the ground, I report to Dr. Durbach and to various stakeholders of World Information Transfer on the events taking place, and ensure sort of our social media accounts remain active during these sessions.
Thank you. This is another question from Vadim Skliakov. if the government reduces taxes on green energy as well as on environmental technology, how will it affect the economies of developed and less developed countries in the future?
So I think that's exactly what needs to happen, right? But that's what's difficult in taking place, because fossil fuel, there are an incredible amount of fossil fuel subsidies that still exist around the world globally due to governments, right? So you have Saudi Arabia, you have the UAE, you have America, where it is still cheaper to produce oil, gas, and coal. In fact, the current plan, according to the current plan, production of oil, gas, and coal, by 2030, we'll be releasing about 39 billion tons of carbon emissions into the world. That is 120% more than what the Paris Agreement is calling for by 2030. So in a scenario right now, clean energy, even though efficiencies in technology production are taking place and solar panels today are cheaper than they have ever been in the past, it is still not taking away from the fact that fossil fuels are still cheaper, right? It is still cheaper for you to buy a gas combustion engine car and fill it with petrol or diesel on a daily basis than it is for you to buy an electric vehicle and charge it on a daily basis. And that requires systemic changes, that requires infrastructure changes from within the economy.
And another question for Marta Gnat. What can organizations or governments do to cope with the problem of the plastic pollutions and to allocate money for cleaning the oceans and other land areas?
It's an extremely important topic, right? And, up to 12 million tons of man-made debris, a lot of it plastic, ends up in seas around the world each year. And pollution kills more than 1 million seabirds and more than 100 million mammals every single year. Governments have been making a lot of strides in terms of banning altogether plastic in many parts of their country, if not entirely. We have a lot of alternative substances and materials now in development, now in actually research and development, that have the same durability and material of plastic and can be used in place, but can be biodegradable as well. But there is a significant amount of more investment that is still needed. And specifically in developing countries where there is a great reliance of the economy on plastics, right? In many East Asian countries, you would still have plastic as the main form of, utilized across industries, not even amongst consumers, but also from factories to other factories. So the ideal situation, as a short answer, would be that governments should ban plastics altogether, and we should globally shift to alternative materials. But if that is difficult in transitioning, then they should have heavy subsidies in place for alternative materials, which raise the price of plastics, that discourage its use amongst consumers.
Thank you, Apurv. Next question is from Wesha Havreluk. Now that I know about the Sustainable Development Goals, I wonder how are those goals determined and the priority of areas for development?
So the Sustainable Developmental Goals, there are 17. Underneath the 17 Sustainable Developmental Goals, you have 69 targets that the world is yet to achieve. All of the goals hit on various social developmental issues, starting from poverty, education, hunger, human health, peace, justice institutions, partnerships, renewable energy. So many aspects of social development are covered by one or more of the 17 SDGs. the issues that are now arising with Agenda 2030 is an understanding of how all of these goals are actually interrelated. And progress on one particular goal can sometimes have a negative impact on another goal. And so that is what we need. That is the main equation we need to hack in order to have a transformative impact on sustainable development. And I'll give you an example. A company might invest in renewable energy by installing wind farms in one area. But if in the process they infringe upon the rights of a local community living in that exact area, it would impede on the human rights of that community, especially if it's an indigenous community, for example. So we need to have a better understanding of how the 17 sustainable developmental goals actually relate with one another, what kind of positive impacts on one area could lead to negative impacts on the other. And we need to have a better understanding of what that balance looks like and come up with innovative solutions on how we can have positive impact across the agenda, rather than just picking few areas and trying to make changes there.
This is pertaining basically again to sustainable development goals. Can you give us a better explanation of how each goal is interrelated with the other? It's a Volkovsky.
Excellent. So multiple ways, right? So let's look at the social goals within the Sustainable Developmental Agenda. If you have an impact on education, if you educate a community, they are likely to eat better. They're likely to have better health. There are multiple studies, and Dr. Durbach has been one of the people researching all of these things, the direct connections between human health and climate as well, on multiple fronts. So if you make progress on education, you better equip the person to live a healthier life. If they live a healthier life, they can have better job opportunities. If they have better job opportunities, they earn a higher living. If they earn a higher living, they can contribute to the local economy. When they contribute to the local economy, they can have better standards of living for everyone else in the community. So this is how there's a trickle-down effect across the Sustainable Developmental Agenda that validates that every single goal is interconnected. At World Information Transfer, we're trying to establish the connection between human health, the connection between human health and degrading environments, right? So that's my quick answer on that.
All right. This is, again, about the Sustainable Development Goals, and which goals will be the most difficult to prioritize?
So I think the social goals, so you can look at all of the 17 developmental goals clustered into 3 categories. You have social goals, which focus on human health and society. You have goals that focus on the environment, and you have goals that focus on markets and economy, around decent work, labor rights, etc. The most difficult, I feel, to establish and to now have progress on will be the social goals. Given that we've had a pandemic going on, which continues to impact the lives of people for the past 1 year, even though we do have a fast approaching climate urgency and an increasingly hot planet, the world is very much equipped with the fact that we need to curb emissions. There is an increasing amount of regulations that are helping companies, that are helping people and governments around the world in understanding this problem. What is not being understood in its full entirety is the social issue. We are still extremely myopic about the fact that social issues in X, Y, and Z region is the main problem that we need to be focusing on. Whereas big bucket social items like population are still not on the table. And that is something that can significantly deter from us achieving Agenda 2030. If we do not give social considerations an extremely attentive eye to detail, then we will have missed the global goals.
Thank you. That definitely is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the most important issues, which due to political and religious agendas is completely disregarded or ignored. So thank you for bringing that up.
I think we are witnessing an age where climate is the main problem, and that is the main hot topic of discussion. And that is why a majority of forums, even the ones that I've mentioned today, are all focusing on green resilience, on rethinking the global economy in light of the climate urgency, putting the world back on track with a 1.5 degrees Celsius, COP26 raising an importance. So yes, you're absolutely correct in your analysis. The entire world is focused on the climate emergency. But we do have another emergency that is rising, and rising with unparalleled acceleration, if you may, and that is population, which I picked up earlier as well. We are already functioning on a planet which is bursting at the seams. And as a response, we're putting more and more people onto it who have increasingly adopted high and wasteful consumption patterns. And to accommodate that, we are in this problem to begin with. CO2 is a function of industrialization. The reason why we industrialized was to meet the needs of every human across the planet. And needs, as we know psychologically, Dr. Durbach, do not reduce. They only keep compounding. If someone is walking from point A to point B and you offer them a cycle, they will choose the cycle. After the cycle, they will have the need for a car. After the car, they will want a better car. So just like that, needs of the human population will keep increasing. And to match that consumption pattern, we will dial up our production. And when we dial up our production, we face so many other problems. So yes, today we are focused on the climate emergency, but I feel tomorrow we'll be focused on the social emergency and be waking up to the fact that there are just too many people on this planet.
Thank you, Apurv. Very important answer. This is another question, and this is on energy consumption. And the question is, we listened to Ms. Pavlova talk about the need for building more nuclear power plants where there are no CO2 emissions, and also are lower costs for the energy. Why is there such a delay in moving on with this project?
Exactly. I love the Virtual Voices series because they have students, and students are naturally curious. And these are exactly the questions that we want to be asking at all of these summits that I've mentioned. Why is there a delay? There doesn't need to be a delay. The technologies out there exist in the market. We do not have to come up with. You do have clean nuclear technologies that can provide clean energy for consumption, right? Two-thirds of the carbon emissions that are released into the world come from energy usage. If we're able to understand and tweak our energy consumption and the sources of energy, we can mitigate climate change. It's really not that difficult. And all of the technologies exist out there. But the problem and the barrier is in its adoption. And this is where regulators and policymakers and institutions like the UN really need to have a firm hand in shifting all of these systems. We have been so determined to cling onto the forms of energy that are now outdated and that we know are causing more harm than doing good to our planet. And we're still sticking to them. And even my question is why? We have absolutely no reason to.
Thank you. Another question. One of the main conditions for sustainable development is improving the welfare and health of its citizens to provide the population with quality drinking water and draining services. Why is this put on the back agenda in so many countries?
That's an incredible question. And that's largely because nobody thinks about water. Everybody thinks you turn on a tap and water is just available. You know, you look at the planet and it's blue. So water is something that we have never thought of as being scarce. And therefore, the regulations around water, consumption habits around water, usage around water has always historically been deprioritized. And we are witnessing that many regions around the world are going to be facing water issues. You know, you had aquifers in Mexico running out, where large companies install their factories, access aquifers of water, which is contained deep within the Earth's crust. And they empty the aquifers, leaving the region, waterless. And that's when you realize that water is a scarce resource, like anything else. But we don't think of it in that manner. And people and citizens don't think of it in that manner. But there is beginning to be greater awareness of water consumption habits. And it really does start with each one of us changing our relationship to water as well.
All right. Next question is the World Bank supporting any of the urban infrastructure and projects? And have they been successfully implemented in any of the areas?
Multiple. So infrastructure is actually one of the core components that World Bank and the IMF finance. If you'll recall, we had a couple of months ago, last year, we had the President of the General Assembly also speaking at the Virtual Voices. And one of the main points that he brought up was, how do we fund sustainable infrastructure projects in the developing world? Money that is currently sitting in the developed world, banks earning negative interest rates, how can we take that money and fund infrastructure projects? Because cities are one of the most polluting hotspots around the world. You look at New York, look at London, where I'm currently sitting, look at Hong Kong, New Delhi, Shanghai. These are extremely, these cities are overburdening an already stretched system. And to fund infrastructure projects which promise clean energy, clean transportation, clean mobility, and sort of higher degrees of human health are something that the World Bank funds, and they fund all over the world.
Thank you. Another question from Ksenia Nikolayenko. You mentioned some effects of coronavirus on employment. What do you think about the coronavirus as a business, especially at a time where it seems to be decreasing? How can we change the situation and stop some people from earning money from a social disaster? Interesting question.
That is a very interesting question, and it highlights the inequality that exists in our worlds. There are, I think Jeff Bezos alone made close to $50 or $60 billion just in this past year. And I think that displays how our entire economic system is so heavily skewed towards the top 1%. And it also just goes to show that you could have a global crisis such as a health pandemic, and the 1% doesn't really get affected. So if you are rich in the world today, you can circumvent any global crisis, probably even climate change, if you have enough money to buy bunkers, etc., which is also happening. But that requires a fundamental shift. Governments need to tax individuals at those rates of income to such a degree that their wealth and income is distributed equitably across across the country. In my opinion, billionaires should not exist. They are outside planetary boundaries.
All right, this is a question from Yulia Koronenko. Do you think that the ecological situation depends primarily on the educational system of the state and its development? How can that be made more progressive?
It does boil down to education. A lot of things boil down to education, because if a society is educated, then they can criticize policies of the government, especially around energy consumption. And that is something that does lack in many parts of the world. People do not question what their governments are doing on some of these extremely important issues that impact not only their communities, but also the world. But we need to integrate stronger information and education transfer around things like clean energy, the use of renewables, the current subsidies on fossil fuels, why it's important for governments and businesses to divest from the gray economy. How can we facilitate a clean transition? People don't learn all of these things until they select or volunteer to study energy transition at a much later stage in life during college. But this is something that needs to be integrated at a much younger level.
Thank you. Another question. This is from Vadim Skriako. I think this is his second question. And this one is related to water. And he says that in the Crimea, there is a catastrophic problem with water. And experts say that the future wars on water are very probable.
That is absolutely correct. Water is sometimes known as liquid gold. It is something that is so fundamental to our survival, and we don't realize that it's a scarce resource. And we won't realize it's a scarce resource until it is too late, because that is exactly how the human condition is. We did not realize that climate change is a topic worth fighting for until it became too late. Same thing will happen for population as well. We are not going to raise alarms on population until we finally reach a point where people are bursting on the Earth's capacity, the Earth's carrying capacity. And the same thing will happen with water. We will not understand that it's a fundamental resource required for all communities, every living being within the planet, until it becomes scarce. And at that point, once something becomes scarce, it becomes worth fighting for. So yes, I completely agree that we can see geopolitical tensions, possibly even wars, breaking out for water.
That's actually, well, you know, the problem with using water for fracking in order to extract, and that's a very huge problem in America. But this is another question, talking also about the economic action from Tanya Horobi. What plan of the economic action can each state do in order to succeed in positive development?
So the groundwork of this was laid in Paris. If we're looking at climate change as an example, what made the Paris Agreement, or what made the UNFCCC COP21 taking place in Paris different? Because what they invited for the first time was that countries come with their own assessments of what they need to do, known as nationally determined contributions. So they invited countries and governments for the first time to produce their own analysis that, okay, how much do you think you need to reduce your carbon emissions by in order to meet the global demand? And this is the same action that every other stage of development needs to take. Countries need to come up with their own ambitious outcomes of how much reduction or positive action do they need to take on a particular topic. And in fact, that is exactly the very thing that is making COP26 that is taking place later this year in Glasgow much more important, because now it's the 5-year review of where those NDCs or those national contributions actually stand. And it's called the ratchet mechanism. I don't want to go into too much detail, but essentially it's going to be a review of where countries stand on what their emission contributions are and whether or not they're in line with what's required globally.
Okay, this is a question. Basically, I have a couple of these questions, and they ask whether you could give the list of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals.
Off the top of my head, I can try. Sustainable Development Goal number 1 is no poverty. Number 2 is focused on zero hunger. Number 3 is on health and human health. Number 4 is on education. Number 5 is on gender equality. Number 6 is on water. Number 7 is on renewable energy. Number 8 is on decent work and labor rights. Number 9 is on infrastructure development. Number 10 is on reducing inequalities. Number 11 is on sustainable cities. Number 12 is on production, sustainable production and consumption. Number 13 is on climate action. Number 14 is on life below water. Number 15 is life on land. Number 16 is strong peace and justice institutions. And number 17 is on partnerships.
Congratulations. I hope that they all copy.
I've never done that before.
Well, that's wonderful. It's always nice to do something for the first time. And this is a question from Christina Froliak. I would like to ask Mr. Gupta, how do you view the spread of coronavirus on social media? Is it shaping our fears? With words related to populism showing up on social media very, very frequently, do you think that the trend of deglobalization is accelerating?
Yes, to quite a degree. We have been seeing a lot of populist agendas. We are seeing a backtracking of globalization because in many aspects, it hasn't worked for all people around the world. It has contributed to global inequalities. The rich have gotten richer, the poor have gotten poorer. And as a result of globalization, we saw a rise in nationalist agendas, countries wanting to shut their borders, saying these are our citizens, we will provide the best opportunities for them first, and then we will go global. You saw that with the wave in the US with Trump. His entire agenda was very nationalistic. We're seeing that in multiple countries in Europe. We saw that in the UK itself, wanting to exit out of Europe, Britain first. So there has been an increasing greater affinity of citizens on these kind of populist discourses. And in the past sort of 5 to 10 years, we have seen a lot of political leaders come to power with this kind of populist discourse. In terms of social media, it has been helpful in disseminating information at record speed globally. People are more aware, people are more knowledgeable about various issues. Sitting in London, I know exactly what is happening in Syria, in other parts around the world, and that is all because of social media. But the benefits also come with cons. There is no mechanism to check facts and news on social media. And there has been a rise in fake news, and that has led to problems with COVID specifically as well. There's been so much of misinformation spreading around. I think it was about a few months into the pandemic when it started trending that if you actually drink the sanitizer, you can eradicate COVID from within your system, and people started drinking household chemicals and sanitizers. So this is the kind of misinformation that social media is extremely quick to spread, and sadly vulnerable people, many young and impressionable minds get influenced by this a little too quickly. COVID is, a virus that spread all around the world, and we have in many parts of the world been very slow to react to COVID. But the one thing that we have seen in COVID is joint partnership between business and government like we've never seen before. Whether it is, production of biomedical equipment that was needed globally, whether it's masks, gloves, sanitizers, the business community realized that they are actually in a very good position in stepping up their efforts in producing what the world needs. The governments realize that they are best in their position of helping disseminate those products to the most vulnerable people with their reach, access, and credibility. And so we did see a good wave of UN business and business government partnerships materialize into something that benefited society. For example, Rolls-Royce started leasing their engine power to produce ventilators. So you did see that level of innovation come through from business and government as well. In terms of to what extent, governments and businesses are benefiting from COVID, yes, there are certain sectors that have had a disproportionate benefit from COVID. So healthcare, for example, given that this was a health emergency. But I'm not quite sure if that was the sole reason why the pandemic was motivated. So.
All right, this is another question from Oya. The task of development should be to increase the level of provision for the population with centralized water systems, sewage services, and health services. To what extent are the developing countries focusing on that model?
So increasingly so, right? We've seen the WASH initiative, for example, and the role that hygiene and sanitization play in prolonging human health. And, the agenda of the Virtual Voices series has sort of Dr. Scott Ratzan, et cetera, who is an expert on some of these public health issues, who can touch upon these. But there is a greater number of investment projects that are underway in a majority of developing countries that focus specifically on WASH initiatives and focus specifically on human health and sanitization efforts as well.
All right. Oops, hold on. Let me get to this. What do you think is, what do you think? I don't quite understand the question, but.
And I actually, sorry, I used another acronym there. WASH stands for Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene.
Okay. Well, that's a very important one, especially Singapore has been pushing it a great deal,
Yes.
as you know, for quite a few years now. So it's interesting that Davos is going to be in Singapore.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, what do you think? What do you think of the race to buy vaccines by countries that buy more vaccines than their populations, and that basically do not know what is the effect of the vaccines? That's the question. Interesting question.
No, very interesting questions off the bat. In terms, so I'll tackle you have countries buying and hoarding vaccines. So you have vaccine nationalizations taking place. And that is not the best strategy globally, if you look at it from the UN's perspective, because yes, we do not know the long-term impacts of this vaccine or to the extent that they're going to be preventative for the virus. And I'm not a medical expert, but the virus has been mutating with an exponential curve, in the sense that as the virus is spreading globally to a larger population, the greater the chances of it mutating into various strains. And we're already seeing that across the world. Now, the problem with vaccine hoarding is that if rich countries that are primarily in the global north start buying up all of the vaccines and vaccinating their citizens first, you are giving the global south and the countries in the global south who don't have enough vaccines right now a fighting chance for the virus to mutate further. And it could mutate further to an extent that all of the vaccines that the global north have injected across all of their populations in major drives prove completely ineffectual. So that is the biggest risk. And that is why vaccine nationalization is a big threat to actually curbing the pandemic. Everyone should have access to the vaccine, which is the only way that we can defeat the virus and stop it from mutating further. If half the world has the vaccine and half the world doesn't have the vaccine, you're only giving an opportunity to an opportunity to the virus to mutate further, where it could reach a point that those vaccines, completely prove useless.
Here is looks like one of the end questions from Danielenko. To what extent is nature conservancy and awareness of the policies of the government and their effect on human population important, and to what extent are these issues are going to be addressed at the global conferences?
So it's not being addressed as much as it should be. Every nation has conducts a census where they have an idea of how many people exist, exactly the number of people that exist within their country, within the region. They maintain statistics on the growth of the population, on number of people being born, number of people dying, etc., etc. And if we look at the past 10-year chart, we will see that global population is only rising. What is not being done, what should be done at all of these conferences, is connecting population growth with other circumstances, with other issues. If you connect population growth with climate change, for example, you will see a direct link, right? Now, I mentioned the automobile example earlier, that currently we have 1.2 billion cars on the road, and by 2030, we expect there to be 2 billion cars on the road, which is going to add more carbon dioxide, 70% more carbon dioxide than we currently need. Now, why will that number of cars increase on the road? It's not like I'm going to buy 5 cars in the next 10 years. Even if I maintain 1 car or max buy 2 cars, it's the number of people. It is all pegged, all of this is pegged based on the number of people. If you increase the number of people that will be on the planet, each one of them will want to have a car, etc., etc. And this holds true for any other industry that you talk about. So really at the heart of change and the heart of the social developmental problem and challenge is the number of people. You want to curb plastics, curb the number of people. If today X% of number of people are using plastics, tomorrow this is only going to grow because the number of people are growing.
Well, Apurv, thank you for a very invaluable and very important presentation. I'm glad that you covered all the issues, not only the conferences, but also on issues that basically do affect what's going to happen with the future generations. I'm very grateful that you have the time and the energy to answer all these questions. And I know that all of the students and all the other people that were listening found this invaluable. So I again want to thank you on behalf of WIT, and of course.
Thank you very much, Dr. Delbach.
And wish you a very, very happy evening and take good care of yourself. So have a good week. Oh yes, and thank you for mentioning that Dr. Scott Ratson is going to be discussing the issues particularly on health, next Wednesday. Take
Well,
care. Bye-bye.
It's a pleasure to present. Thank you, everyone who's joined from around the world.